One of the most underanalyzed and underappreciated aspects of the housing unaffordability crisis is the crisis in the residential construction industry, at least from a serious political economy standpoint. Because, you've got slop all across the media, you've got slop all across the algorithm saying that, Albo owns 47 or 43% of my business or whatever, that bullshit, right? No, this is a much more endemic problem to the residential construction industry in Australia. This industry has been, I don't want to say in crisis, because I feel like the word crisis is just so overused, but, it's pretty cooked. And that's not the opinion of, again, just a bunch of slop on social media and a bunch of small business owners. But when, people actually investigate the residential construction industry, they find a pretty severe problem. And the problems are interesting because they kind of go against what people like Karl Marx, Big Carl, said about capital, about its tendency to monopolize. And that is true in a lot of instances. In fact, I think, in this country, in Australia, we've seen a big tendency for industry to monopolize. But I think because of the way in which our economy is set up, certain industries will monopolize, whereas certain other sectors will remain fragmented, disparate, disconnected, but that's in the service of these monopolistic titans in other industries. I think that's the case for the residential construction industry in relation to the financial sector. But okay, what are the problems? Well, the Productivity Commission actually wrote a pretty good report on the residential construction industry and its problems, where it very clearly shows that productivity in the residential construction industry has declined significantly compared to productivity in the rest of the economy. And it lists a multitude of factors contributing to this declining, decrepit industry: complex, slow approvals, lack of innovation, lack of scale, and workforce issues. Everyone loves to harp on about the first one, complex, slow approvals, the regulatory system, how overburdensome it is and how much it ruins the lives of small business owners and developers who just want to build housing. Now, it's worth noting that the parts in this report that talk about a, slow and complex approval system, it's taking a lot from lobby groups who, have a material interest in having less regulation, a faster approval process, right? That isn't to say, though, that there isn't some degree of complexity or inefficiency in the residential construction industry, in the regulatory code, right? There absolutely is. But the problems in regulation aren't just like a piece of the puzzle. They only make sense in the context of the broader brokenness of the residential construction sector. And as I kind of alluded to at the start, I think that the residential construction sector is a deeply fragmented, deeply problematic, fraught with inefficiencies and market failures throughout, an arrangement which fits quite neatly into understanding the political economy of housing and Australian capitalism. It's very interesting, right? Because on one hand, you've got a very fragmented industry. You've got lots of sole proprietors, lots of small businesses, lots of small developers, renovators, you name it. Tradespeople that come out and, fix your toilet or fix your electricity. These are mostly small business owners, people who are self-employed, that kind of thing. Whereas on a civil site, it's, labor hire firms, for example. And combined with that, you've got a very decentralized property market where you've got a majority of the population who own their own home outright. They make up a majority of the housing finance, and the majority of landlords are small landlords. They own one or two investment properties as opposed to dozens. And on top of that, Australian urban spaces are predominantly made up of suburbia. Most people live in the suburbs, and most of those people own their own homes. They own their single allotment, their family home with a fence or, a lawn or whatever, right? Chances are they've got a mortgage. And that is a very dispersed, decentralized, disparate, fragmented way of arranging an economy, right? You've got your homeowners who make up the majority of housing finance, who make up the majority of people. And you've got a bunch of sole proprietors and small businesses who, provide goods and services, commodities for these homeowners. But who doesn't provide commodities to homeowners? That's right, the non-sponsor of this video, the Renters and Housing Union. We speak a lot about solving the housing crisis, the causes of the housing crisis. But the most effective way, by far to address whether it be cost of living, housing, whatever, is to start at the point of production. And that means joining your union. I work for the Renters and Housing Union. We help tenants against their landlords. You know, in a country and an economy so thoroughly dominated by real estate, it is incredibly important, indispensable for working tenants to be unionized. Over the last year or so, we've been really ramping up our collective bargaining campaign, which means we bring tenants of different landlords together who then unite to bargain as one, using their leverage as the ones who pay rent to the best of their ability. And through this, we'll be able to achieve lower rents and better conditions. And it's not just the changes themselves that matter, but the way in which these changes come about is really important, because it's one thing to legislate a really nice piece of reform in Parliament. But the difference between that and a union winning something is that the people who are in the union, the workers or the tenants or whatever, right? They learn that they have leverage. They have the ability to actually win something. And so they'll go further and further. Anyway, if you are remotely serious at all about trying to address the many, many problems with Australia's housing market, the best place to start is with your union. So join Rahu. But then you switch over into the financial side of things, and it's a lot of monopoly players. The big four banks are called the big four banks for a reason, right? They are the biggest players in the Australian economy. They are the biggest shares on our stock exchange. They dominate the financial world. I believe like 90% of the financial system is the big four banks. And any kind of non-banking financial intermediaries, basically, any financial institution that is not the big banks in Australia, are superannuation firms, and they're increasingly monopolistic as well. These huge conglomerates which pull vast sums of capital. I'm talking trillions of dollars here. And as I've been over in many other videos on this channel, banking and non-banking financial institutions are both very deeply invested in the residential property market, though in different spaces. But yeah, we've got this very interesting dynamic where, the quote unquote real economy, I don't like that term, but that's a different discussion. For the sake of simplicity, the real economy, where things are produced and sold and whatever, right? Renovations, fixing a toilet, fixing electricity, that kind of thing, homes built, sold, distributed, etc., planning, that kind of stuff. It's very, very fragmented. Lots of small players. It's a lot of small players all coming together, right? Underpinning that, though, is monopoly finance. It's these huge conglomerates that are financing this operation who benefit, monetarily from this arrangement. And so it's one thing to say that, housing is a financial asset. And most people kind of just stop at it's like an asset, and like people, they speculate on it and the asset goes crazy. It's like a bubble, right? It's not just a bubble. It can be a financial bubble, but also it doesn't necessarily have to be a financial or an asset price bubble, right? We could be in Ponzi finance. We could be in hedge finance. The fact remains that housing is a financial asset. And what that means, just beyond that, kind of populist politics, is that the current arrangement exists because of monopoly finance capital, because this arrangement is the most beneficial towards them. Productivity isn't necessarily something important to these institutions. What's important is that the greatest amount of rent, fees, extraction, value, perceived or real, that can be taken from, the market. That is what's important. And they can use that value, perceived or not, to then lend out further and further and further, and thus, increasing their profits, increasing their share values, etc., etc. And so you cannot understand the dysfunction of the residential construction industry without understanding the function of the financial system. And it's pretty insidious, because not only is the financial system, this is something that they, I guess, are incentivized to, want and pursue, but the way in which housing is set up in this country is that the vast majority of the population are also incentivized to want to maintain and uphold this arrangement. Because the majority of the population own their own home and a plurality of the population are paying off a mortgage, they want house prices to continually, perpetually grow and grow and grow. And, it's not just that. A lot of people's, disposable income comes from the equity they've built up in their house, particularly elderly people. Housing is one of the most important tools of welfare for the elderly. Something like 2/3 of elderly people who don't own their own home live in poverty in this country. Anyway, so people who own their own homes, the majority of the population, want house prices to grow and grow and grow. And if you have a dysfunctional building industry, well, you're not going to have the productive capacity to, build medium density homes or high density homes. What you will get though, because this is the tried and tested Australian method, innovation in the sector sucks. What you will get are these suburban sprawled out shitboxes which go on and on and on and on further out into the countryside. You have places like Donnybrook, right, where it takes like an hour to get out of the estate area, which would otherwise take 5 minutes if it wasn't peak hour traffic, because it's just one lane that goes out into the highway. Furthermore, the residential construction industry, like the actual builders themselves, are increasingly reliant on access to finance to maintain their operations. And this is why Australia's kind of perpetually high interest rates, at least relative to the last 5 years, that's why it's kind of been such a sting to the industry, because for years and years, the residential construction industry enjoyed incredibly low interest rates, right? Such easy access to finance. And then COVID came along, right? Where the Reserve Bank was figuratively printing a fuck ton of money as credit, which, banks were then allowed to lend out to businesses like construction firms. And so more than ever, and this has been a long-term trend, but more than ever in the last 5 years, these construction firms became so reliant on finance. And even it wasn't just from banks or financial institutions, but, between each other as well. And so when interest rates creep up as quickly as they did in this country after, 2022 or whatever, it really, really hurt. Loads of businesses went under. Now, this isn't a sub story for these businesses, right? I'm saying this industry doesn't work because of the way in which the capitalist mode of production is arranged. If I had it my way, these small business owners wouldn't be the ones who would be directing production when it comes to housing. Let's just say that. But yeah, when you have that kind of spike in financial instability, of course, what you get is a rapid decline in the dwellings that, the industry is able to churn out. Now, this isn't to, buy into the narrative, the YIMBY narrative of, it's just a supply issue. If we get rid of all these constraints in supply, we'll fix it. They don't understand political economy. If we could snap our fingers tomorrow and establish the regulatory framework that those guys want, again, we wouldn't see, a housing crisis fixed, nor would it be something possible in the current, arrangement between social classes and how they interact, right? That's just not how that works. But again, that comes from a misunderstanding of political economy. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that, while I'm not buying in totally to the YIMBY narrative, the point about a dysfunctional residential construction industry is a pertinent one, and one that, the left side of politics, the union side of things, needs to contend with. Because again, let's say we, snap our fingers, we have a public developer, we, have this big program of public housing. You can't unravel decades of dysfunction, of financialization through, these reforms in government. There isn't this infrastructure ready for the state to seize and take a hold of, and only then, when the state directs production, then we can, achieve a housing utopia. No, it's not. It wouldn't work like that, unfortunately. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people limit their policy making to simply just trying to refine statecraft, trying to be the best statesman or political party you can be, without trying to reckon with the actual, social conditions on the ground in reality. Let's take the Victorian government as an example as to why it's not possible to, fix our housing problems just from the level of the state. So the Victorian government, they're embarking on what's called the big housing build, and essentially they're spending billions of dollars on social housing. So that includes some public housing, but predominantly community housing, which is owned and managed by private corporations, which are ostensibly non-for-profits. I've made many videos about it. I talk about it numerous times, but essentially the arrangement is that a community housing provider, a private landlord, will get private finance from an institutional investor or a financial institution. After they, do their operations, they build housing or they manage properties, the government subsidizes them with what's called an availability payment, essentially just, subsidizing their entire operations. But their operations is, remember, paying back debt to a private financial institution. Anyway, this is like the perfect example of, why simply just increasing government spending and government action in a sector won't cut it, because this is probably the worst way to try and, finance social housing and try and build social housing and try and build housing, period. And it's not an accident, right? This isn't just like because of a couple of evil people in the Labour Party who are conniving and trying to think of the worst way to build housing. No, these people, it's not like these are evil people. I'm sure there's evil people in the Labour Party. But like, it's not, this is a Australia-wide thing. For example, the union movement or even the federal Greens, for example, they talk in terms of social housing. And the reason is, it's because this is how our society has been built over the past 20, 30 years, whether it be shifting how the public service, shifting how they interact with housing and the broader public sector, how they interact and manage public assets. Since 1993, that's undergone some really significant changes. Or again, whether it be how fragmented the construction industry is, you've got these consortiums of so many companies and community housing providers, all trying to get their finger in the pie. All of whom, again, are appendages of these monopoly financial institutions. It is this arrangement that governments inherit. And so when they go and try and, build public housing or social housing or whatever, right? These are the industry stakeholders. This is the public service that they inherit. This is the building industry that they inherit. This is the electorate that they inherit. This is the financial system that they inherit. Simply trying to wield the state and trying to push it in a more moral direction, right? Whatever that means. It is impossible to just unilaterally switch back the culmination of decades and decades of interactions between social classes which have produced the conditions we see today. And I'm sorry, but it's a pipe dream to believe that a single electoral project can overturn, again, the culmination of decades and decades of social trends that we've seen. If you have your head screwed on, you don't believe that this Labour MP or that Labour MP or Jacinta Allen or Anthony Albanese are uniquely evil individuals. These politicians, political parties, governments are simply just the product of an ensemble of various different social classes and their representatives. But anyway, if you are someone who wants to seriously contend with our housing crisis and understand that it's not just a problem of unaffordability or high prices or, this nebulous idea of a asset price bubble, right? But deeply understand what financialisation is and how it interacts, how monopoly finance interacts with our fragmented residential construction industry, with our highly dispersed and disparate urban situation, and the likewise disparate and very spread out home ownership base. And I think, look, it's my view, but I think it's pretty clear that changing the winds and changing the directions of social movements and social classes and whatnot, that is not the prerogative of electoral politics. Electoral projects, politicians, they just follow whichever way the wind is blowing. Everyone loves Gough Whitlam, right? No one loves the idea of having to spend 2 decades to build up to the point where the union movement can call a general strike and create a cascade which led to Whitlam winning in 1972. But yes, anyway, sorry, weaving in a few different things there. If you want to understand the housing crisis, understanding how the residential construction industry works is necessary. Understanding declining profitability, declining productivity, understanding fragmentation, understanding the role regulation plays in all this. This is necessary to understand the housing crisis. Again, not from a, this is simply just a supply problem, right? But understanding that, low supply, scarce housing, whatever way it manifests at the moment, right? That is not an accident. That is not a mistake. That is a direct product. It's an intended feature of our current system and how it works. And it's the result of the interplay between various different social classes and, of course, the state.